Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us on Facebook and on YouTube for our program this evening, An Evening with Jane Kirkpatrick. My name is Bob Abbey, and I'm an adult services librarian for the city of Forest Grove. Our program tonight is both a culmination of our summer reading program, which was really devoted to Jane Kirkpatrick and two of her novels, but we really encourage you to read all of her fiction. And also, in a way, this is sort of a kickoff to our fall online virtual programming offerings. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that we've got coming up and a little bit more about how the evening will shape out, and then I will bring Jane on to talk about her new book, Something Worth Doing, which I have right here. And we will also be giving away 5 signed copies, and I'll be drawing names a little later in the evening for that. So just a little bit about a couple programs that we've got coming up next month. On Tuesday, October 13th at 6:30, we'll be live streaming a program with Seattle-based science writer and author Eric Wagner. Eric will be talking about his new book, After the Blast, The Ecological Recovery of Mount St. Helens. 2020 is the 40th anniversary of the eruption of Mount St. Helens, and Eric has done some really fascinating work looking at how our assumptions about that landscape around the mountain have changed thanks to the work that scientists have done. And it really is looking at how life responds in the face of total devastation. It's a fascinating book, and it'll be a really great program, and I hope you can be a part of that as well. And then 2 weeks after that, on Tuesday, October 27th, also at 6:30, we are going to be hosting 3 local historians who are going to be talking about reshaping Oregon's suffrage history, a topic that's very relevant for our discussion this evening. We'll be featuring Jan Dilge, Kimberly Jensen, and Jean Ward. Jan is the principal of History Built, a historical consulting firm, and she's also the curator of the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education's core exhibition entitled Discrimination and Resistance, an Oregon Primer. Dr. Kimberly Jensen is a professor of history and gender studies at Western Oregon University. She's written several books, including Oregon's Doctor to the World, Esther Pohl Lovejoy, and A Life in Activism. And she's currently looking at how Oregon women participated in the period around World War I and the growth of the surveillance state in the period from 1913 to 1925. And then Jean Ward is a professor emerita of communication at Lewis and Clark, where she taught for over 40 years. Her research is focused on Pacific Northwest women such as Abigail Scott Duniway, who will be the focus of our conversation this evening, Bethania Owens Adair, and Mary Beatty. And she's currently researching the experiences of Blacks in Portland's early African American community. So they'll be on hand to talk about Black women and suffrage activism, women who oppose the suffrage movement, and then also looking at Oregon's early passage of the suffrage and right to vote, and how that connects to the passage in 1920 of the 19th Amendment. So those 2 programs coming up in coming up in October 13th and October 27th. So mark your calendars for both of those. And the best way to stay in touch with us is to connect either on Facebook or on YouTube. And the next time you're over on YouTube, hit that red subscribe button and the notification bell. And that's a great way for you to stay in touch and to stay up to date with all of the really interesting stuff that we're producing in order to stay connected to our community. So those are just two things that we've got coming up, and I'm really excited to share those with you. As I mentioned, our program tonight is really a culmination of our summer reading program and also launch of our fall programming. We're very fortunate to have with us Jane Kirkpatrick. Jane is the New York Times and CBA bestselling and award-winning writer of over 30 books, including Everything She Didn't Say, All She Left Behind, A Light in the Wilderness, Sweetness to the Soul, which won the prestigious Wrangler Award from the Western Heritage Center, and Homestead. And then the two titles that we focused on this summer, This Road We Traveled, which was published in 2016, and One More River to Cross, published in 2019. Jane has also been the recipient of the Carroll Award for Historical Fiction and the 2016 Will Rogers Gold Medallion Award, among others. So we're very pleased to have her participate in our summer reading activities. Jane and I also recorded some book discussion sessions throughout the summer, and those are available on our YouTube channel. So I'm going to bring Jane into the stream. Hi, Jane.
Hello.
How are you tonight?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Good. Well, welcome. Welcome to our live stream presentation this evening of An Evening with Jane Kirkpatrick. We're really happy to have you here with us. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to step aside and let you have the floor. And
right.
I'll be back when you're done.
All right.
All right.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Oops.
Well, first I want to get there yet. First, I want to thank Bob and the Forest Grove Library for having me come and be a part of this event. And I'm looking forward to the additional sessions that are scheduled for later this fall. So I hope others of you will participate in that as well. And then I want to thank you, audience out there whom I can't see, but I believe are there. And thank you for giving up some of your time to spend with me this evening. That is a precious gift to have you share with me and talk about stories. And that's basically what I do, but that's what you all do too, because stories are the most powerful way we have of organizing human experience. D.H. Lawrence said, the stories tell us who we are and who we will become. And when William Faulkner accepted the Pulitzer Prize in 1954, he said the only stories with the writer's blood and sweat and tears were stories of the human heart in conflict with itself. Willa Cather, who also won a Pulitzer, she said the stories that engage us as adults are based on experiences that we had before we turned 15. And interestingly, many of Abigail Scott Duniway's stories, the 22 novels that she wrote, drew on that early life of hers, and when she was crossing on the Oregon Trail from Illinois to Oregon in 1852. I think that stories are the sparks that light our ancestors' lives, and they're the embers that we blow on to illuminate our own lives, that's how powerful stories are. And so tonight I thought I would tell you some stories about, and I like to do my little alphabet thing, I call it. It's where I tell you stories that the first word of which will eventually spell another word. So the word that I want to talk about tonight is votes. You probably can't read this, if there it is, but I have this little banner, and this is one of the banners that were worn, was like that, worn in the during the time of suffrage movement, and it says votes for women. And so I thought that I would talk about just the nature of this story and this incredible 100th year celebration of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which in which women, it's hard to say we're given the vote because they earned the right to vote. And so it's a great time to be celebrating and talking about the role of women and the role of women's rights. So there's a picture that I think Bob's going to put up, a picture of Abigail Scott Duniway when she was a little bit younger than most of the pictures that you'll see. So Bob, if think you're there. You're going to pop that up there. And so this is a picture of Abigail Scott Duniway, and I would suspect she was probably in her early 40s. Abigail was a remarkable woman. She was a mother, a sister, a an author, a newspaper editor, a millinery, a businesswoman, a millinery, a teacher. She was any number of things. And one of the things I like about this picture of her, as opposed to many of the ones that I've seen, is where she's much older, and I'll show you one later. But there's a certain softness in her face in this photograph, I think. And I think it really speaks to who she was as the part of her that was a wife and mother. And this book, for me, I wanted to really explore some of that possibility of what her life might have been like. I first learned about Abigail from visiting the state capitol, where there are 126 names of prominent Oregonians from history, and there are 6 women who are listed there, and one of them is Abigail Scott Duniway. And so I became intrigued. I've written about a couple of other of the women who have been listed in the Oregon history around the Capitol, and Abigail is the 3rd woman that I wanted to write about. So let me just go with votes as a way of outlining what I'd like to share with you tonight. So the V word stands for vulnerability. And that actually is a word that comes from the Latin, and it comes from a word that means wounded. And for Abigail, there were many wounds in her early life. And one of them was the travel that they made in 1852. And on that journey, both a younger brother and her mother died of cholera. And so it was a tragic journey. And she also came with the understanding that her mother had not wanted to come. And often that happened with the Oregon Trail crossings. But it was either stay behind and without your family, or it was go ahead and go with, because her husband, Tucker Scott, as he was called, wanted very much to go west. There is a quote from her mother that Abigail provides in some of her material, where her mother said that why do we have to leave? We've spent our whole life just being ahead of civilization, and now it's finally caught up to us. It would be nice to be able to have a little time. Her mother also at one point said to Abigail how sad she was that she was a girl, because she knew a girl's life would be much harder than a boy's life. I think Abigail took that to heart, and that was part of the woundedness and the vulnerability of being a woman in the 1850s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. There's a slide. I want to have Bob do the next slide, which is part of a cartoon or whatever that was used in, and it will be hard for you to read, but what I want you to see in that is a woman with buckets on her shoulders, and she's looking up this ladder, and the first rung on the ladder is slavery, and then it says house drudgery, and then it's shop work, clerks, agents, maids, teachers, caretakers, bookkeeping, stenographer, nurse, private secretary, business repairs, school affairs, church and charities, war workers, public office, government work, law, medicine, and then equal suffrage. And that's not even the top of the ladder. But it suggests the kind of effort and vulnerability that women faced in order to move forward, in order to have more access to equality, but also more access to a better life. Education was one of those vulnerabilities. Abigail had limited education, whereas her brother was able to be schooled. He was a boy, and he was actually the first graduate of Pacific University. He was the only graduate that year. He was a self-made man and became quite a competitor with Abigail, even though he was her younger brother. But education impacted children and adults and women around the world, and especially in the frontier life, because without that, they were stuck in poverty. They were stuck dependent. There were laws that, for example, prevented women from being able to move forward after, let's say, a spouse or a father died. If there was a debt, often the daughter was required to pay that debt. One of the stories that Abigail tells is a time when a woman who had been divorced came to her for a loan, and Abigail loaned her money so she could buy furniture and have a boarding house, which was one of the respectable jobs that women could have. Boarding house and teaching, or running a millinery, for example, or a business that was, you know, respectable. And so she loaned her the money, and the woman bought the furniture and got her boarding house set up. And her ex-husband rolled in and said, "What's yours is mine." And he took everything and sold it and took the money himself. So these are the kinds of things that really began to gall Abigail, for sure. There's another slide that I think Bob will show, and it's part of a political cartoon during the time of the suffrage movement. And basically, there's a city employee who is standing on a ballot box, and he's reaching for higher wages. Those are the bags of money that are at the top, and it says city money chest. And the woman is pointing to the ballot box and says, "Oh, if only I had that box." And there's a little cartoon to the bottom that says, "A sure cure for short reach." And that would be the right to vote. And the bottom of her skirt says that she's a school teacher. One of the things that happened for Abigail that continued to sort of fuel her feelings of injustice was that her sister Kate, who married and had 4 children, and her husband was a steamship operator and was comfortable. Her husband could even afford to hire help for her. He was killed in an explosion and left her as a widow with 4 young children. And she applied for a job as a teacher because she thought she would be able to manage with that salary. And she was offered the job, but at half the salary of the previous teacher, which had been a man. And this was something that really continued to irk Abigail, and want something different, and continue to pursue the idea of the best way for life to be better for women was that they would have a right to vote and respond to the laws that affected them, which they otherwise had no access to change. So the second, the letter in that vote is O, and it stands for openness. One of the things that Abigail had to come to grips with is that she would have to be open to doing things differently. There's evidence that she didn't really want to get married as soon as she did. She urged her daughter, for example, to wait to get married. But there were some family issues that will happen in the book that you can read about. But it really moved all of the girls in the Scott family to get married perhaps sooner than they had intended. Abigail was a teacher at the time. She had passed the test and liked teaching, and she liked the salary that she got that was her own, and she could spend it her own way. But there was a push from the family that she needed to get married, and fortunately, she loved Ben Dunaway, who came forward. He was an affable horse trainer, farmer, and he loved her dearly from everything that would be indicated. So she was open to making a change. She would have to not become this independent woman like a Susan B. Anthony, who never married, but rather marry and function as a housewife. And that didn't necessarily keep her down. She was a good housewife, but she hated housework. And she often wrote about things like concepts of hiring, that women should be able to be paid for their housework, and then they could afford to go out and do other work that they really liked and pay women who liked housework. So she had some progressive ideas. She also felt so strongly about some of the issues and began writing a newspaper column for one of the agricultural papers in the valley, the Willamette Valley, and it was called The Farmer's Wife. And she took on a number of issues there. It was somewhat anonymous in the beginning, but she was pretty outspoken and would often tell tales about her husband, Ben. It was, when I was reading about that, I had to say that I write a newsletter, a Story Sparks newsletter, and I often tell stories on my husband. And I wondered about Abigail and Ben, and his willingness apparently to let her talk about and use themselves as examples of the kinds of struggles that couples were going through financially and maritally, and having children, and controlling birth rates and so on. Eventually, Abigail realized that that was simply not going to be enough, and that the really big movement that her life, the big openness to something different, was when she attended a suffrage event in California. She had gone to Jacob Meyer in Portland with a proposal to borrow money from him to fund her millinery project, her millinery house, and he was so taken with her business plan and also her passion for her subjects that he loaned her way more than what she had intended. She went to California, she bought the items, she came back, and she went back 3 weeks later, paid him back, and then borrowed twice the amount again. But while she was in California, she attended a suffrage gathering and was, for the first time, asked to do a presentation, a public speaking event, to talk about the role of women and the importance of the vote. And that really began to change her life. At that point, they offered her $800 to travel around and speak. And she thought that would be wonderful. And she sent a telegram to Ben and said, Ben offered $800. It'll help during the downtime this winter. And I'll be gone for 2 or 3 months. He sent a telegraph back that said, come home immediately. And because she was a good wife and because she knew that in order to be successful, she had to maintain her respectability and support of her family. And she came home thinking there might have been a family emergency, but there was not. One wonders how many conversations they had over the years that might have been a little steamy that she had to turn down $800 during that time period. Another word that I would say, or another aspect of being open, is that there were very few women editors at that time, and actually there are still very few women editors. But Abigail encountered a woman editor in California and asked her to consider being an editor of the Empire, I think it was called Empire newspaper in Portland, Oregon. And she came back from that event where Ben told her she had to come home. And she posted an article in the Oregonian at that point about the fact that she was going to be doing this editorial work for a newspaper. And that was in 1870, but very shortly in 1871, she decided to have her own newspaper called the New Northwest. There's a really terrific book about many of the articles in the New Northwest. Jean Ward and Elaine Mavity, if I pronounced her name right. But there are many excerpts, but also just great historical commentary about the New Northwest. And Abigail, for 17 years, maintained that newspaper. The whole family eventually got involved. They were selling subscriptions, and the boys were printers. And she went on. She would write while she was traveling, and did serials of many of her books that later became novels. But it was very rare for a woman to be an editor of a newspaper. There was one back in 1852, back east, who was one of the few women editors. And there's a book about her called The Trial of a Common Scold. And at this moment, and it's probably, I haven't taken my Prevagen, I can't remember the name of that scold. But what I do remember is that she was very offended that she was called a common scold. And it was a law that allowed, it only applied to women, and that if women were considered too rabble-rousing, they could be charged with being a scold. And if found guilty, they would be dunked in a tub of water. And I could see Abigail also being offended by if she were to have been a common scold, the scold she would have lived with. So she had this newspaper. And then the last thing that I would say that indicated her openness to being and doing something different is that she became a public speaker at a time when it was quite uncommon for a woman to be speaking publicly. She was a very gifted speaker, and you can actually go online. There's a professor at USC, Randall Lake, who has a passion for recording her speeches and also making commentary about them. And so it's online, and in the book, you can do that, but you can also just Google Under Her Own Wings and read these incredibly well formulated presentations. It's said that she never read the speeches, she memorized them, she knew her material so well. But she did write them out and would often reprint them in the paper. So she used all those platforms that were not considered normal within that time period in order to pursue and promote the rights of women. So the T word stands for tools. And I'll just give you one brief tool that I think she must have used often. It's actually one that some of you may have heard because I frequently talk about this, but this is a coping saw. And when my husband and I were building our place on the lower John Day River, he sent me down to get a hacksaw. And he was kind of grumpy. And he said, "You know what a hacksaw is, don't you?" And I said, yeah, I know. And so I went down there and I got a hacksaw, which is, the blade is a little lower. But I also brought this one back. This actually has Florida rattlesnake on it, not Oregon rattlesnake. But I brought it back and I gave him the hacksaw and he was happy. And when he was finished, I said, "Well, what's this called?" And he said, "Well, that's a coping saw." And I said, "You mean like I have trouble coping with you? That's a good mental health word." And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, what's it used for?" He said, "It's used to fit things into tight places like a cabinet into a corner or the sides of a picture frame." And I still didn't really understand why it would be called coping. And he said, "Well, it's the blade. The blade is really strong, um, but it's also flexible. If it's too strong, it'll splinter what you're trying to fit. And if it's too flexible, it'll leave gaps. Then in order to cope, you have to have both strength and flexibility." And he said it like that, just there on the sagebrush. And I remember thinking, the Marlboro Man meets mental health. And another man actually later told me that a coping saw allows you to change directions quickly without a lot of friction. And for Abigail, and a time in which she lived through a very volatile time, post-Civil War, everything was changing, uh, industrialization, all these things that were going on. She was living in a very challenging time, as are we, and she had to keep coping. And there were times when she was so rigid, and it did splinter where she was trying to fit. Some of the arguments that she got into with the National Women's Suffrage Association and other premier women involved in suffrage, she splintered some of those relationships. But she also learned how to change directions quickly and try not to make a lot of friction with it. And that was an important tool that she had to use. Another tool that she had was that she believed in the still hunt, she called it. There were lots of suffrage activities that involved lots of banners and women marching and heavy protests actually, and sometimes they would go in and take over saloons and do a variety of things. And Abigail didn't really want to have a part of that. She really felt that compromised what she hoped men would begin to see, and that was that they didn't need to be afraid of women getting the vote. She separated out prohibition from getting the vote, and that often, brought her into conflict with other women's groups. But she felt really strongly that the way to win over men who would ultimately have to vote was what she called the still hunt, and that was meeting with them individually, meeting with legislators, educating the voting public. So in that instance, it was men, but educating them about how it would benefit them and not just women, that it would make all lives better, that it would help the contributions of so many people if women were able to vote. The E word stands for engagement, and engagement is one of the a word that actually means promise. And for activists and people who pursue, as Abigail did for 40 years, a passion, she had to find a way to be engaged. And one of the things I've come to sort of explore with these different women that I write about is where they drew their strength from. And one of the things we know about Abigail is that she was both purposeful and she was disciplined. Now, some people would say she wasn't always disciplined. Her brother, for example, who was the Oregonian editor, she submitted an article to him and he rejected it because he said it needed a lot of work, that it was poor grammar and bad punctuation. And I sort of imagined her saying, well, holy cow, Chips, you're an editor. Why don't you just edit it? But he later did publish some of her pieces. But I think the fact that she was disciplined in the still hunt, for example, some people might call that being stubborn. But if you read books about successful people who are able to accomplish things that they set out, that capacity to stay focused on the purpose, to stay engaged, and to be present for the moment that they were in, and then with discipline be able to keep moving forward, was a critical part of who she was and the engagement that she remained in. Um, a woman a number of years ago came to me one time and told me that when she was 5 years old living in London, it was after the war, and she had been running in the rubble, and she fell. And she said when she fell, she bloodied her knees and bloodied her hands. And she said she remembered laying there and saying to herself, "Why should I even get up?" She said, "I was 5 years old." And then these two women came, and they were dressed in black, and one of them, she said, lifted her up and just held her in her arms. And the other woman took a white handkerchief out of her purse, and she put it against her knees and just held them there. And she said, those women were not in my life for longer than 5 minutes. But I remember saying to myself, when I grow up, I want to be like those women. And as I thought about that, I thought that what those women did, they didn't rescue her from a bad dad, which she had, that she was orphaned. Later, her mother had died, but they did what they had available. They gave what they had. They stayed engaged totally with this little girl in a time in her life, and it made all the difference. Abigail was able to stay engaged with the women that she encountered. She visited them in asylum. She talked to them during fitting sessions at the millinery. She was willing to walk beside them and get eggs thrown at them because she stood in front of a group of people and publicly spoke at a time when women were not permitted to do that. And then finally, the S word stands for a seeker. And one of the things I've noticed about many of the women I write about is that they have something that matters to them. They are seeking something to make a difference both in the world around them and something for themselves, but also something that is greater than themselves. Abigail, in her memoir, talks about the moment in which she decided that what she needed to do was work towards getting the vote. And she said she describes it as somewhat of a religious experience. That the sun comes down through the windows and just sort of illuminates the room. As Ben is saying to her, "Don't you know the only way this is ever going to change for women is if they get the vote?" And I think that continued to sustain her and support her. That belief that this was part of her mission as a human being on this earth, to be a seeker and to sustain herself as well as others, to be able to constantly get up and not fall down, or get up, and if you fall down, just learn how to get up again. This last picture I want to show you is a picture of her. It's a portrait photograph. Some people have said, it took Oregon 6 campaigns to get suffrage, and no other state had that many. The first one was in 1884, and then it was finally won in 1912. And Abigail lived to be able to vote, and she was the first woman to register to vote in Multnomah County. This is a portrait picture of her, and I love it that she's reading a book, and she is looking quite fine. She was probably a member of the Oregon Women's Club at that point. She actually helped start the Portland Women's Club. And women's clubs, by the way, are celebrating, that women's club is celebrating its 125th anniversary this year. So you can see on their list of presidents that Abigail's name is there. But I love that this is a picture of a woman who continued to pursue. She was vulnerable and wounded, but she didn't let that hold her back. She kept looking for new ways to be open to possibilities. And yes, she could be stubborn, but she also could make changes. She used the tools she had of, coping, but also a great imagination, an intellect that was really quite remarkable, and being willing to step into a new ways of promoting her ideas. She was engaged and stayed engaged for 40 years. So that was really quite remarkable, especially when there were so many defeats and how hard that would have been to keep getting up and moving forward. And then she was a great seeker. So the last slide is actually something that I think she might have said, which is powerful is when you want to quit, but you keep going. And this is actually a wonderful little piece of wisdom that was given to me by a first grader when I spoke to schools a number of years ago. And Abigail was a teacher, so she might have heard something like this too. But I asked them, the kids, how they would define powerful. And one of them said, "Oh, it's when you're rich." And another one said, "No, it's when you're big and strong, especially on the playground." And then this little first grader sitting before me who had been quiet the whole time, he said, "Oh no, powerful is when you want to quit, but you keep going." And I think that's the message that Abigail's life has left, at least for me. And I think it's a message for all of us, especially in a time like this. Abigail endured floods and fires and, and slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, but she kept going. And she must have wanted to quit, but I think we remember her all these years later, and her name is up there in the Capitol for a very good reason, and that was that she didn't quit. She kept going until the goal that she had in mind was finally reached. And I think that's a message for all of us at a difficult time, and with COVID and smoke and all the other things in our air, to be able to remember that we are powerful. And powerful means when you want to quit, you keep going. So I hope that that's a message that even though this is about a woman who lived, 100 and some years ago, that it's a message that will resonate with you and that it will give you encouragement for facing whatever you have to face, and remembering that someone like Abigail also dealt with a difficult time and she kept going. So I think that's it. I think Bob's going to come back.
Hi, yes, thank you. And by the way, thank you all for providing your comments. The great thing about live streaming is that this is truly interactive. And so I got some great comments about
Great.
playing around with the image on the screen, and that was really helpful. So thank you for that. And this is your opportunity to ask questions, to make comments. We will have an opportunity throughout the evening to share some of those. So as these comments come to mind, as you have questions, please put them in the box, and we will get to them for sure. First thing I want to do, though, is I want to draw our first name, and I'm going to use my trusty lunch bag for doing that. I actually wrote down all of the names of the folks who entered this drawing, and we had a great response. Thank you all so much. So I'm going to shake these around. And if you're watching, if you're out in Facebook land or on YouTube, and I call your name, and I'm just going to call your first name and the first initial of your last name, send up a like, a love, respond in the comment field. It'd be great to know that you're out there watching. All right, so the first winner is Cheryl B, as in boy. Cheryl B is the first winner of our autographed copy of Something Worth Doing. We have 4 more that we'll be giving out throughout the evening. So congratulations, Cheryl. So one of the things that we've talked about, Jane, over the course of the summer is your approach to writing about a character. And you've talked in several of our conversations about 3 questions that you use as you approach a project. And I'm wondering if you could share those with our viewers and talk a little bit about how those related to this particular book.
Sure. So there are actually 3 questions from a book called Structuring Your Novel by Roberts and Fitzgerald. And it's a book that was published in the 1970s. But if you are a budding novelist. I highly recommend this book, and I reread sections of it before I start the book. But the three questions that they recommend you answer before you start writing, the first one is, what's my intention? And the corollary to that is, think of it as the elevator sentence. You get on the elevator and someone says, oh, you're a writer, what are you working on? And you've got one floor basically to tell them what the story's about before they leave or their eyes glaze over or whatever. And so for Abigail, for this book, I would tell people I'm writing a story about one of the premier Northwest suffragists from the 1800s. It was just a flatliner. With all of these, I might write 7, 8 pages before I really get a handle on what I think the story is about. But I answer each of the three with one sentence. I get it down to one sentence, and then I put those 3 sentences up in in 8-point font on top of my computer, so that when I get lost in the middle of the writing or wonder why I ever thought I could write this or what a stupid idea this was, I can look up there and get refocused. So the second question is, what is my attitude towards the story? And I think this is a really fascinating question. Sometimes I've read books that I finished that and I've asked that question to myself, thinking, well, what was the author's attitude? Because sometimes books are, life is hard and then you die. And that's sort of the attitude that comes out. And I didn't really want to write. I wanted books to be hopeful. They didn't have to be happy, but I wanted them to be hopeful. And the corollary to that is, what do I feel deeply about? And one of the things I felt very deeply about in writing this story and in researching was about the vulnerability of women during that time and how that affected Abigail's life and her mission to bring suffrage to women. And then the third question is, how do I hope a reader, well, the one-liner is, what's my purpose in writing this book? And the corollary to that is, how do I hope a reader might be changed? And I had a couple of thoughts with the answer to that for this book. And one was that I hoped that I could present a picture of Abigail that wasn't such a strident, rigid, getting into trouble kind of woman, because she could be, I described her as having an intemperate tongue, and she could be outraged at various things. But I hoped also that as people read this book, that they will see her as an activist, but as also a very human woman who really cared deeply about her family, cared about doing the right thing with her family, and yet was torn between a career that really called her and a brilliant intellect that she just had to keep pursuing, lifelong educating herself and others, and that push and pull between a career woman and a family woman. And so I think that's a very contemporary struggle for many of us, of family and career. And so my hope for a reader being changed is that they might get some insight in reading this book about how Abigail did that and perhaps some of the mistakes she made in the process.
So the focus that she has on publishing, and this is a theme that runs through the book, these opportunities and this commitment to spreading her message through publication. And it struck me as you were talking that the tendency to view Abigail as someone who is stubborn or strident or whatever other adjective you want to use, that we don't necessarily apply that to her brother, who is also stubborn and strident, right?
Exactly.
But she definitely was very committed to using the media as a way to disseminate this message. Can you talk about how that idea emerged and how she nurtured that idea over time?
Well, I suspect that, and she got a lot of interesting feedback from those early articles that she wrote in the agricultural papers. and that people wrote back to letters to the editor, and I think she saw that interaction as really a critical way of educating people, and she was willing to. She said things that other people would just be upset with her about, and that didn't stop her. She listened to what they had to say, and I think she shaped her message to some extent, but she didn't stop moving forward. The publications during that time, newspapers were incredibly powerful, as they are now, but they were even more so then. And actually, the American frontier was quite well read. There were a number of newspapers that were available for people. They might not get them in a timely manner, but they got them. And people had public meetings in which they discussed things that were in the paper. And when Harvey actually he had been the head of the library. You would like this part, Robert, because he was head of the library in Portland.
Yeah.
That was his first job after he graduated from Pacific University. But he wrote an essay after Lincoln's death that was quite poignant and quite remarkably conveyed. And the head of the the publisher of the Oregonian, Pittock, at that point, approached him to become the editor of the Oregonian. So Abigail could see that publications also brought about potential career movements, and she was quite envious of Harvey. And at one point in the New Northwest, she makes the comment that Harvey was 27, I believe it was, when he became the editor the first time. He then later went to become the customs agent and then came back to the Oregonian. But she said something about, well, if I had been educated, I would have been an editor at 27, too. And so she saw also the linkage between, he was a man who he was educated, and he got a career boost, and her lack of education kept her back. And I think that was one of the reasons why she liked the idea of having, being the editor of her own newspaper. Mm-hmm. One of the things that in 1884, which was the first campaign, she and her sisters met with Harvey, and there's a wonderful article in the Oregon Historical Society, I think it was probably published in 1982, but it talks about their incredible conflict and feud. But she and the sisters convinced Harvey that it was going to pass. And Abigail had most of her contact with with farmers and the shopkeepers and so on. And many of those men were perfectly comfortable with women. They worked beside their women in the fields, and they understood that they were bright, capable people, and no one had to be afraid of them getting the vote. But Harvey was really moved among the movers and shakers, the wealthier, the people who moved from Boston and sort of bought Boston mores and structure into the Portland area, and so he had been opposed to suffrage, but they worked on him, as she and her sisters, and convinced him, and he wrote an editorial. It was in the fall before the election in June, but he wrote an editorial in which he said there was nothing to fear with women getting the vote, and when the vote happened, it was beat 2-1, and Portland basically beat it. The rest of the state passed it, but the Portland area did not. And I think he never forgave her for that, because he never, ever, ever after that ever supported women's suffrage, and in fact did what he could to stop it. And so he used his bully pulpit of a newspaper to truly impact and delay for years the success of vote. And in fact, Harvey died in 1910, and it was after that it passed. So it never passed. While he was alive, he was that influential and powerful. So.
Mm-hmm. I want to share just a couple of the comments that we're getting in. We've got some questions, but just it's really nice to read folks saying hi. We've got Bonnie, who's saying hi from Lakewood, Colorado.
Oh, wow.
Formerly from
Welcome.
Corvallis. Hi, Bonnie. Nice you could join us. Lots of folks saying how much they enjoy your books. That's the majority of the comments that I'm seeing. And let me see here. Folks, thanking you for being a part of this program, which I will also second.
My pleasure.
We've got a question from Mary, who is asking about Georgiana Pittock and Abigail, and did they have any relationship? Was there any connection between those two folks?
I'm not familiar with that, but I suspect maybe perhaps later on, when Abigail was part of the women's group, the Oregon Women's, or the my brain just went dead. The women's organizations, the women's clubs group, which was later on in the 1890s, early 1900s, when the women's groups began to do things that were working on behalf of social issues. Many of them also wanted to be able to do things that would support women's suffrage. But in different states, for example, in California, the women's clubs did beautification things. They were doing things to try to, they were interested in women's suffrage. That was what they wanted, but they were trying to calm down or, temper any of the stridentness that men might raise, which would, and they could then point to this, we developed this park, or, we started the school, or we've been helping with refugees. And so things to show that they were engaged in civic life and in a positive way, and that there was nothing to fear. Pittock, being Harvey, I'm sure would have known her and been involved with that. Harvey's wife was not a suffrage supporter. And so I think the family gatherings might have been interesting. So I really would have some suspicion that she would have, I think she longed to be in that social circle, to be able to be a part of that. But I suspect she was not necessarily invited into that kind of social circle. Mm-hmm. And there may be others, maybe that's, there are other people that might have more awareness of that than I do, but I didn't encounter any specific interactions that she would have had.
We just got a comment from Dixie in Wichita. Hi, Dixie in Wichita. Thanks for joining us. So one question that I just saw is someone is asking what you're working on next.
Well, I just turned the book in on September 1st. I'll give you my one-liner. It's the story of Natalie Curtis, who was a classically trained child prodigy musician who has a breakdown when she's about 25 years old. And then her life is changed, or she changes her life when she becomes an activist for Indian rights, Native American rights, and wants to save their music and deal with the negativity of assimilation. So the working title is The Musical Healing of Natalie Curtis. But you don't always get the title that you choose as an author. So we'll see what the editorial committee comes up with. I had to give them 10 other possible titles, but that was my working title. So.
Right. That name is familiar to me as a musician. I think she's one of the sort of pioneers of ethnomusicology, and particularly studying Native American music down in, I believe, in Arizona.
In the Southwest, Arizona, New Mexico, Yuma. Yes, it was a fascinating story. I really hope I have conveyed it well. I really hope I have.
Right, and that her family was also friends with Teddy Roosevelt.
Yes.
So there was
her uncle had gone to school with Teddy Roosevelt, and that relationship was critical in Natalie getting access to Indian music, because at the time it was illegal. It was against the code of offenses for Indian people to sing their songs, to dance their dances, to speak their language. And in order for her to try to preserve these, the music and the arts of Native Americans, she needed to have them, she needed to record them. And she had to get permission from Teddy Roosevelt, President of the United States, to make that happen. So it's a fascinating story, I think. So.
Yeah. Well, I know in our discussions you've been talking about turning that in, so I know your deadline
Yes.
was looming.
I turned it in.
Great. I'm going to pick another name.
Okay.
Going into my lunch bag here, and the second winner is Myra S. Myra S. is winner number 2 of our signed copy of Something Worth Doing. Myra, if you're watching tonight, hit that like button, hit the heart button, whatever you want. Let us know that you're out there. And I'll be in touch with everyone who wins a copy just to make sure that we have all of your current contact information. And so we want to make sure to get this to you without any delays. Let me take a look here and see if there are any other questions that are popping up. Again, please feel free to add your comments or questions. As one thing I do want to point out, we've had a couple of folks mention about YouTube. YouTube is fine now. There are no issues, so you should be able to watch there as well. We just got one. Let's see here. This is from... Well, Linda says, I've been looking forward to seeing you again. Thanks for sharing an inspirational message. This is so relevant to these times. But I've noticed that about your work. And I think we've had that discussion too, that in these particularly difficult times, the characters that you focus on are really great models for how to persevere and how to dig a little deeper. So in terms of the scope of this character of Abigail Scott Duniway, this is quite different from many of the other main characters that you've focused on in your past books. I mean, she is someone with a large presence.
Right.
How did that affect the way you approached her?
Well, usually I'm spending a great deal of time in the basements and archives of, libraries or courthouses and so on, just trying to dig up all kinds of details, because women's history, as Virginia Woolf said, women's history must be invented, both uncovered and made up. So it's often difficult to find some of the details that would widen the character. With Abigail, there was no paucity of detail. There were just wonderful books and wonderful articles that had already been written. There were all of her speeches. There were the copies of the New Northwest. And so the work in some ways was sorting and deciding what to keep and what to leave. And I will make a confession that last year I turned it in on September 1st. And in the middle of October, my editor got back to me and said, we have a problem. It is that I think you've lost the story, that it's more nonfiction than fiction. And so it was like I couldn't leave anything out. It's like if I knew the name of the ship's captain that she wrote on when she went to California the first time, I felt a need to include that somehow. And it was a great editorial comment, and I had to rewrite most of the book. And that was a good decision, because I had lost the string and the thread of the story of Abigail as a woman that I had wanted. I looked up there on my little 3 answers, but I'd gotten on a different bus halfway through. And so I had to go back and get on that first bus that I'd been on before. I think part of that happened because at the same time I was working on this book, I had been invited to write a nonfiction chapter for a book called Eminent Oregonians on Abigail Scott Duniway. And so that editor actually got back to me and said, I think there are a lot of novelist devices here that perhaps it's a little more story than we want. We need more of those specific facts and an analysis of the specific facts. So in some ways, I had to rework that one too. But that was really good, a good reminder of the power of story, and whether it's nonfiction or fiction, it's the story that really compels people to keep reading. And nonfiction requires the detail in order to provide credibility for the reader, and fiction also provides detail. It's just that it cannot be overwhelming. That if I use the name of a ship's captain, a reader will expect that character to show up somehow. And so I've had to learn to go back and redo that in the writing process. So yeah, so it was a challenging book to write, mostly because there was so much material.
Right, right. So it's, I mean, in a way, it sounds like there might not be quite as much room to sort of fill those gaps. You're just connecting dots, and
Yes.
the tendency to make it too much of a biography or too much of a character study in nonfiction would
Right.
probably be pretty tough to overcome. Did you get a chance to read through much of the New Northwest? What was your take on that?
Well, one take of it, and a friend of mine who has done some printing said that she thought that Abigail must have had a very good press because there's a lot of clarity in the reproduction, and that sometimes old newspapers are pretty fuzzy, but that was one thing that I think she would have been. She had top of the art equipment, and that told me some things about the kind of thing that she felt strongly about. The storylines, she writes as though she's talking to you in the living room. She uses the kind of the third person we. We started this newspaper in order to, promote women's rights, or we went to Portland last week and encountered thus and so. And so she writes about very personal, her journeys. It's kind of like a travelogue in various places. She was very upset with with Pacific University, for example, about a child who was the child of a mother of a madam who had placed a child in Pacific University, and there was, it was like the reputation was being questioned because this was an illegitimate child of a madam. And Abigail took that on, and she took on the instructors of Pacific University and said, "Hey, you said that you were a Christian organization. What do you mean? This is a child that has a chance to, move forward." And so she took on a lot of issues in addition to her women's rights issues. But it's very readable, and it's very entertaining in many ways. She traveled so much, and she was a great observer, and so she could tell you about, the color of the dirt in the stagecoach where she was on her way to Idaho, or what the smell of the room was when she spoke in the back of in the back alley because she was kicked out of a church that didn't want her speaking there, and so on. So it's really interesting to read. And if you don't have a lot of time or you don't want to get online, I do recommend Jean Ward and Elaine Mavity. I never know how to pronounce her name, being a reader and not always a listener. But it's called Yours for Liberty, and has a lot of excerpts that are really interesting to read. So I highly recommend it. Yeah.
Great. Oh, I see. Hi, Cheryl.
Oh, good.
Our first winner. Hi.
Our first winner, yay.
Yeah. Well, and I think that, I want to just talk a little bit about Abigail as a teacher, because, that attention to detail and that sort of focus on your surroundings seems to come through in her commitment to teaching. Can you talk a little bit about that aspect of her life?
Well, she was basically homeschooled, and in part, I think, through all of the newspapers that were available, that her parents were well read. There were lots of books, and I think she would have wanted to go to school, but she was also taking care of other siblings. There were 12 children in the family, and she also was described as being sickly, and so maybe she just couldn't go as often as her other siblings. So she had a little primer that she brought with her, and she used that to study and ended up passing the teacher's test. And so she could teach. And I thought it not only gave her that independence that she wanted, but she loved the excitement of new minds, and she would use um, innovative things. So she made some comment at some point about how she would, I mean, she would get up at like 3 and 4 in the morning and try to read ahead so that she had something, to present to her pupils and be just a couple of steps ahead of them. But she would, they would measure the floor of the school in order to work on geometry, or because they didn't have texts. Some of them didn't even have slates. So she had to use the natural world and the world around her. And she's very imaginative, very innovative. And so I think she really enjoyed that. She was one of the schools, they lived in different places, but one of the schools was called the Union School. And that was the great clarity to let people know she was on the side of the Union and not the Confederacy. And Oregon actually had a tendency to be on the Confederacy. A lot of the early Oregon residents were from Missouri and Kentucky and those areas, which tended to be lean towards Confederacy. So she was willing to stand up there and say, this is a Union school. And I think that it pleased her no end that girls came to school, and that's part of what she thought really would make a difference. And actually, the work that's done around the world now in developing countries, everybody seems to agree that if you educate girls and you work with moms and women, that the whole family benefits, that poverty is, people are raised from poverty by education and by expanding the capacity of the human spirit to think and to innovate and to do the things that change their worlds and their families at the same time. So education was extremely important to her. I wish she had been able to go to Pacific University. I think she would have just challenged the professors and, made them better instructors too. And I'm sure that she and Harvey must have had just horrendous discussions because they were two great intellects. And maybe if they weren't talking about suffrage, they could talk about many other things. Harvey was very well read too, and so there's just no question about that. Yeah. So, and in fact, when I was doing research, someone had sent me. She had written a short kind of eulogy for Reverend Bishop, and Bishop was, is all connected with the Pendleton woolen mills, and he had owned the woolen mill in Brownsville, and so there were all these connections. And we were trying to verify whether she had gone to the funeral or whether she had just written the eulogy, and it had come through the Pendleton woolen mills executive department. And the interesting thing was, it's now 100 and some years later, but one of the members of the Bishop family said that he was quite sure that it was written by her and it was written for their ancestor. And he said, they had a terrible rivalry. Abigail and Harvey had a terrible rivalry. And I thought, here it is 100 and some years later, and this is what is still remembered about that family, is this great rivalry. So it had its weight during the time, and it continues to have its weight as a thread of history.
Right. Well, conflict is what, that's
Yeah,
what,
I know.
that's what keeps us going, right? Well, and it just as an aside, we first meet her in your book. We first meet Abigail in the capacity of teaching, and she's in that environment, and just the way she thinks about her responsibility as a teacher and being there and wanting to be prepared and wanting to create this space for children to learn. And I think that, it's another great testament to how awesome teachers are.
Right. And she later, she had a school in her own house, and then later took a salary job to teach for someone else, and then turned their house into a boarding house with young girls that lived there. She was always trying to find a way to make money. and teaching was one of the surefire ways she could do that. But then things got difficult. The great floods of 61, 62 in the West damaged, so many people, and they couldn't afford to send their kids to school, and so she had to find something else, and so she started a millinery, and especially after the Civil War, she knew that there was going to be this great economic boom with the war over, and she wanted to be in the middle of that, and she was with her millinery. So she was very, very successful woman.
I want to pick another name. I see that we have Pat is saying hi from Wisconsin. I love that we've got folks from all over.
That's my home state. So cool. Hi, Pat.
Yeah. Pat lived in Forest Grove for many years and worked at and graduated from Pacific. So
all right.
Hi, Pat.
Good.
Okay. Number 3. Our recipient number 3 is April L. April L as in library. All right. Congratulations, April. We talked a little bit before we went on about Abigail's husband, Ben, who is a very interesting character and plays an important part in her life. Can you talk about Ben Dunaway and how you approached his character?
Well, he was affable. He was a couple of years older than her. He was one of those men who fell in love with her, and there was nothing that would ever deter that. I think he would have waited forever for her to decide whether she was going to marry him or not. And because of some of the constraints on the Scott family, he lucked out getting married to her sooner than Abigail might have wanted to. He was inventive. He actually invented a washing machine, I'm sure, because, washing clothes was a major issue for pioneer women, and it was hard work, and there were women whose backs were injured, and I think they died young because they had to do this laundry. And so he developed, she probably complained enough, but he did that. He trained horses. He was a singer. Partway through it, not very long into their marriage, I think maybe they had 3 or 4 kids, that he was injured in an accident. And that was another vulnerability, I believe, for Abigail, is now, would he be able to work again? How would he be able to work? And the treatments during that time was a back injury. People used laudanum a lot just to deal with pain, and that sort of kept them, you never knew for sure what was going to happen. My own husband had a major back injury. He lives with 13 crushed vertebrae, and has lived with that level of pain for the last close to 50 years, and that presents strains on relationships and fears. And before that accident, one of the things that happened is that Ben made a really poor decision, economic decision, a financial decision, and Abigail had tried to prevent that from happening. She writes about that in quite detail, and he said to her, "Oh, don't worry about it." He basically co-signed a note for someone, and he said, "Don't worry about it. You'll always be protected." And I think that was something that for Abigail, she never quite forgave him for that, because it meant they're going to have to sell the farm, and lots of other things happened as a result of that. But as I look at that relationship, if that hadn't happened, if she hadn't felt this push to, I've got to do this, I've got to do that, she might not have done half of the things that she ended up doing. And she had a reason, because she could say to herself, well, I have to do this because Ben's not able. And so the travel and all of that, Ben ended up being a house husband, looking after the children. And then Harvey offered him a job with the Customs Department. And he gave up his farm and gave up his horse training. And for 15 years, he worked for the Customs Department, and probably at a job that didn't have a lot of physical demands. And he must have hated being inside in that way, because he was such an outdoor man. And yet he did that because that's what the family required. And so I think in many ways he was the perfect fit for her because he wasn't challenged by people saying, "Oh, you're just henpecked. You're just a weak guy because you let your wife travel and do all this stuff and be outspoken." I think he knew his own person, and he so loved her and adored her that I don't think she could have done anything that would have deterred him from being 100% of support behind her. And
Hmm.
and most activists, if you read about biographies of activists, if they have someone who they know will always be there for them, it is another way that they are able to get back up when they have been taken down.
The relationship between the two, between Abigail and Ben, comes through so well in your book. The
Oh,
the
good.
kind of the repartee between the two of them, the kind of gentle teasing, and also after he's injured, and his sense that he wants to, he maybe has unrealistic expectations, and she's there to kind of be a bit of a reality check, and to remind him that But I mean, the way you do that is it's almost sort of like an internal thought, like no, you're not ready to do that, or no, we're not quite there yet. So, but that wonderful relationship between the two, I think, is such a treasure in this book, and he's a fascinating man. And as I've mentioned to you, I mean, many times in your books, I feel like I come away encountering a character that I'd like to spend more time with, and he was one of those people.
No, that's good. Yeah.
I really.
Well, I remember once doing a presentation somewhere in Washington, and it was for a historical society, and a man came up to me afterwards to get a book signed, and he said, "This was my birthday present to come and hear you speak." And he said, I want you to know that I feel like you've given me back, you've given me a way of looking at my life that is good and safe." And he said, "I think I should have lived 100 years ago. But I just want you to know that your stories and the men you create in these books, they're flawed and they have their problems, but they are also people that you would want to spend time with." And he said that, he just wanted to thank me for that. And all I could think of was, and these are great people, and I've had the privilege of spending time with them. And I'm delighted that this was a reader who wanted to spend more time with one of them. And that's great that you did too. Yeah.
Yeah, I think often for me a mark of a book that has meaning is when I close the cover and I really want to just spend more time with them. I'm sad that I'm not going to be with them anymore. I want a sequel. I want to go back and reread, and sometimes I'll do that. I'll go back and reread. But let me see here. I want to read a couple more comments, and then I'm going to pick another name. Actually, Susie asked a question: what drives you to continue writing year after year? I love your characters and their life lessons that you write about so eloquently.
Well, what else would I do? I would probably weigh 300 pounds and just eat chocolate if I didn't have these people to spend time with. I think what really compels me, though, is that I really don't want these stories to be lost, women's stories to be lost. The very first book, the very first novel I wrote was A Sweetness to the Soul, and it was about a local couple, a Central Oregon couple. But I thought their story was so compelling, and I really thought a real writer needed to write it. And it couldn't be me because I had never written fiction, and it wasn't my relative, and I had not lived in that community 100 years, so that I felt I had the privilege of trying to tell their story. And my husband said, "Well, if you think it's a great story, you should just write it down. And if other people don't like your version, they can write their own." And so I thought, well, that was pretty good advice. And so I made a decision to get up in the morning and set the alarm at 4. And that my plan was to be at the computer by 5, because we were homesteading. I was working for the Warm Springs Indian Reservation, and that was the only time I could think I could write, from like 5 to 7. And so the next day we went to a historical society meeting, and a man said, to me, what do you do? And I said, oh, I'm a writer, and at that point I had written articles for newspapers and I had written Homestead, but I hadn't written anything else. And he said, what are you working on? And I said, I'm writing the story of Jane and Joseph Shear and their life with the Wasco, Warm Springs, and Paiute people. And I had not yet written a sentence, but I always felt like I had done the hardest work because I had made the commitment to get up and to tell that story. And he said, well, you should meet my cousin. He said, she owns the original property their homestead was on, and I'm sure she'd let you walk there. And I have to tell you that almost every one of these books has had someone like that has come into the story and the research that I never would have been able to find. With Abigail, I went to a site called Find a Grave. And I was looking for a photograph of one of her sisters. And it was this photograph, and it said had been posted by Bob Speckham, was his name. And so I bravely emailed Bob Speckham and told him who I was and what I'd done. He said, oh, well, I know who you are. I've heard you speak. And he said, yes, I am a descendant of one of Abigail's sister's husband. And so it was like this wonderful gift. And I read a quote from Van Goethe, the lyricist from the 19th century. And he said, what people don't realize is once you make a commitment to something, then providence moves and things begin to happen that you otherwise never could have imagined. So I think what happens for me is I make a commitment to try to tell this story, and then the story takes me over and leads me along, and I get to meet incredible people, descendants, other people, and be just inspired by the opportunity to spend time with these people. So that's part of what I think compels me, and I feel really privileged to be able to do that. So until I get senile, and some of you might have to tell me that I am, or when I get there, it's my hope to keep writing and to keep telling these stories.
Well, the comments that I've seen are overwhelmingly grateful for you doing that, and
good.
And please continue. I'm gonna pick another name. We're now at number 4. Reach in here, shake these up. All right, and Lorna S., who actually just commented a few minutes ago. Lorna said, I appreciate the books so much because they give flesh to history. I'm glad that you've written about Abigail Scott Duniway because she's sort of a hero of mine. So now
cool.
you get a signed
Very
copy.
Good.
Yeah,
Very
congratulations, good. Lorna.
I'll try to remember that, Lorna, because I get to sign these to people. So I'll try to remember that she's a personal hero of yours.
Yes.
Just tonight, I was invited to do a book group in Corvallis, to Zoom it. And the woman who contacted me is a descendant of Tucker Scott's second wife, Ruth, who is in the book, the stepmother. And I was just like, that is so cool to come across to come across descendants. I just love that. And for people who, whether it's the character, is a personal hero, or it's an ancestor or something. I just love finding those little intersections. It's pretty cool.
Yeah. Well, I want to just wrap up. We've got one more name to pick, but I want to just wrap up by asking you, what do you want readers to take away from this encounter with Abigail Scott Duniway? What do you want them to know about her that they might not know, or that they think they know?
I would like them to know, one, that I think she was a really remarkable mother, that she had one daughter and five sons. She called them voters. She had 5 voters. And how hard it was to constantly having to balance this great passion she had for women's rights, to support women and to make a difference in the lives of women, and at the same time try to be a really good mother. And I think she struggled with that, and she got defensive at times, because to be the career woman that she needed to be, she had to be gone. And that was really criticized. She was criticized for the travel that she did, for the time away from her family, and the time that Ben basically took over the parenting role. And so I think I'd like people to sort of look at her as a family woman, and not just as this activist and suffragist, but as a woman who like us, has everyday challenges and constraints, whether we're married or we're not married, or but frankly, right now, thinking about mothers who are and dads who are homeschooling and trying to work. I frequently read tweets, weekly tweets of, parents, funny tweets, and one of them was, I cry in the shower, I shout in the car. These are my only times of absolute quiet, and I have a sense that I'm still going to be able to make it, but they're just torn. And I think that Abigail's purposefulness and her discipline are really good things for us to carry with us, that to get through these really difficult times, to remember that the goal is just to do the best we can, and that to not judge ourselves so harshly, because every day is a new challenge and every day is different. So I think I would like them to take that kind of inspiration away. The word inspiration means the act of breathing in, taking something in for the long haul. So if they get time to read this, which is the other issue when all these things are going on, if they get time to read it, that's part of what I hope they would take away. So.
Well, let me pick our last winner. Reach in here, shake these up. And Charlene B, as in Bob. Charlene B is number 5.
Right.
So we've got 5 lucky winners who will be receiving signed copies of Something Worth Doing. And you will enjoy this. Those of you, and the comments attest to the number of fans that have been watching tonight and participating. Thank you all so much for your comments and your questions. And please join me in giving Jane a virtual round of applause. And for being so giving of her time this summer and this evening. It's been a great joy getting to know you and chatting with you and learning more about you and having you be a part of this process, which is a very important one for our community. We've got lots of readers here. You've got a huge fan base here. So this has been great. Well, Jane, thank you.
I would be remiss if I didn't remind people that Abigail and the suffragists worked really hard to get the right to vote. So don't forget to vote. She would bop me on the head if I didn't take time to say. She'd say, "Holy cow, Chip! You had all this time. Why didn't you tell them to vote?" So
the last thing you didn't remind folks to vote. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Jane, thank you so much for being a part of this evening and for being a part of our summer reading in 2020. And thank you all for being a part of our live stream tonight. And we will look forward to seeing you all again in October 13th, for Eric Wagner and our live stream program about the ecological recovery of Mount St. Helens. Everybody take care, be safe, be well. We'll see you soon.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Take care.